Tune in to the Fintech Files for exclusive interviews with fintech executives and thought leaders. We will talk about how the industry will overcome the crisis that has marked the start of the decade, how it can be part of the solution, and how the financial world will evolve in the next decade. This is your host, George Alaferis from Arama.
On this episode of the Fintech Files, I'm talking to Daniel Lanyon, Editor-in-Chief of Altfi, the leading trade publication for the alternative finance and fintech community. We're going to talk first about the state of fintech. How robust is the industry, and what are the big battles happening in the field right now? Then we'll discuss about what Altfi did to adapt and come back stronger from the crisis, and they have some big news. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, George.
As it's early June, but we're still officially in lockdown, may I start by asking you how is that working for you? How did that affect you, personally and also professionally?
So I suppose, I've been lucky in many ways and have had a very, relatively easy period, I think, compared to lots of people. I haven't been, personally affected by anything, sort of tragic. But of course, it's definitely been a huge change, and were it not for the most amazing weather ever, I think it would have been a lot harder. But it's been nice in some ways, and I think there's been some positive things for Altfi as a business. There's the sort of demand for information has gone up. More people seem interested in what is happening. In our core coverage of fintech. So there's been lots to keep busy with. I guess I've also got around to doing lots of tiny jobs around the house, which is very satisfying. And so that's quite nice. And, I've actually really enjoyed spending more time at home cooking and spending time with my wife, which has been a lovely thing. But I think there's nobody who hasn't been touched by some sort of stress, whether that's just being a bit cooped up or being a bit uncertain or having to change plans.
Yeah, sure. I do get a lot of that, and that most of the people I talk to ultimately have fared very well. But obviously that's because we don't talk to people who really challenge. So may I ask about your current role? You used to be a journalist for non-fintech media. And so how did you now, I think fairly recently, got into fintech?
Well, not that recently, about 4 years ago. So I started out, being a journalist about 10 years ago. I started out reporting in Istanbul in Turkey on economics and business, which is my sort of academic background. And I suppose I very much pursued a lot of young journalists' sort of dreams of working for some of the big titles, and I did some work for some of the, I guess, more famous names from newspapers like Times, and I guess I pivoted more into the sort of trade business B2B area of journalism. Initially for a magazine called The Grocer, which is actually the oldest trade title in the UK, probably the world as well, which covers the food industry. And that was probably where I first started covering, I guess, what I later came to know as disruption. I started to cover, what are called the discounters, the supermarkets like Aldi and Lidl, who are growing very rapidly, offering a different proposition to the sort of the well-known large names in the UK. And I guess I had an opportunity to join a startup, which is something I'd always wanted to do eventually. I wanted to grow something and be involved in something from its early days. And I met a guy called David Stevenson, who was the founder of Altfi. So that was back in 2014. 2016, and we started from fairly humble offices, and we I think we had a great area and a great sort of overarching idea, which was covering the sort of change in financial services. It's now grown to be a pretty well-read publication. We've had about 500% growth in about 2 years in our audience, and that's been really encouraging to see. I guess we've been also quite lucky that there has been a strong growth of interest in this area, which I think at times feels a bit nebulous. But yeah, I think it's a very, very fascinating business story of the last 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, sure. And the progress of Altfi is of course due to your excellent coverage, but the interest in fintech, or the fact that fintech is now such a commonly used word. I guess from my perspective, the evolution in my mind from what you were mentioning 2016, 14 is huge, right? I don't know when I started using the term, but I feel it's fairly recent. So can you tell us a bit more about what Altfi does and maybe the services it offers on a corporate level?
Yep. So we are fundamentally a trade magazine for this area, this industry that we call fintech, which it is a bit of a nebulous term. As I was saying, I think I even asked one of the largest investors in fintech, whether they were very bullish on fintech, and they actually said, well, I don't really even know what fintech means. And I think that's a really sort of important point for us as a publication, because obviously every publication needs a perimeter of what do you cover and what don't you cover. What is a story that's of interest to your readers and what isn't. And I think that has changed over time. So initially when I joined Altfi, the core coverage really was alternative finance, which really was all about disruption to the lending world. So banks not lending post the financial crisis, or I should say the last financial crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And huge disruption from players such as Zopa, Funding Circle, and RateSetter in the UK, providing finance to companies who otherwise were not getting what they needed, or individuals as well, from traditional banks. And that was where the term Altfi came from, alternative finance, its portmanteau. And I guess it was around 2016 that we started covering, and I say we, so my former colleague Ryan Weeks, names such as Monzo and Revolut, those guys started to become extremely interesting, partly because they were crowdfunding their equity capital. So they were using the likes of Crowdcube to raise money, and that space just seemed very, very interesting. Not least, the first time I downloaded these apps and was blown away really how intuitive they were, and how on your side they were, how simple they were, how quickly you could do things. And then I guess as they started to develop into banks and get banking licenses, how so quickly all your friends knew about them, and then all their friends, and then older people you knew, and people not just in London tech and finance circles. So I think that was really a sort of a long way of saying that we as a publication have now come to see that there's a very, very long secular story of change in financial services, and it's not just about technology. I think it's also about attitudes. It's about what people who work in banks or work in financial services look like. What they wear. It's their working patterns, what the core skills are that are in demand. I saw a statistic the other day that technology expertise focused roles have increased in demand by 50% in 3 years in the UK, but of listed job adverts. And I think there's this sort of very long-term story going on, and we're seeing sort of different iterations and different different technologies, different movements, different regulation affecting that. And I guess what we as Altfi see as our longer term mission is to try and keep ahead of those new changes, because we sort of feel they're all part of the same long-term trend, sort of mega trend.
Sure. So that brings me to my next question and the outlook now in 2020 after so much happened, right? And probably things have accelerated over the last few months with the crisis. And of course, you've got a unique viewpoint on the industry, being editor at Altfi. So you mentioned Monzo Revolut, the first experience back in 2016, and now we've seen the news that they're restructuring. I don't know if that's the right term, and perhaps there's a new wave or a new phase happening. Could you tell us a bit more about that? What's your perspective into those players and the old players coming into fintech by recruiting, like you said?
Well, so I think fintech in the last year, so let's just say in 2019, really blossomed from a something that did seem a bit more of an insider's world, to being something that was becoming much more mainstream. Enormous amounts of venture capital were flooding into startups. The growth of staff numbers at some of the largest firms was pretty stellar. I can't give you exactly accurate data, but just from my own sort of personal experience, I'd see companies expanding, moving offices, doubling in size in terms of how many people they employed in a matter of months rather than years, which is a really extraordinary thing. And I guess, there was always the expectation that, trends don't last forever. There's always something that shifts. And it's always hard to put your finger on what it is. But I think we did see a bit of a change towards the end of 2019. And how I explained it at the time was you sort of had four different players now, very much sort of squaring up to each other, almost like four boxers in a ring, if you can sort of imagine that. And one of them was very much the disruptors, the startups, Monzo, Revolut, etc. in the UK and obviously around the world, lots of other interesting names, Chime, N26, etc. Then you also had the sort of I guess what I call the super apps. So WeChat Pay and Alipay, both obviously from Asia, and increasingly looking at doing things around the world, very much in Europe, although quite tentatively. And I guess then you had the sort of legacy banks who were, perhaps already undergoing significant amounts of change. So, maybe the sort of let's just say the top 5 banks in the UK and obviously around the world, many more who are already undergoing a sort of a digitization process, perhaps not as quickly as they should be, but nonetheless, doing so and still having enormous scale and sort of firepower. And then in the other corner, you had big tech, and we're all very familiar, Amazon, Facebook, and those guys increasingly were launching things. So obviously, we had Libra from Facebook, and we had Apple's partnership with Goldman Sachs to launch a sort of credit card. So I think you almost had this sort of new parity where you had 4 very different players who all had a viable argument to why they were, why they could be the future, at least in part, of what financial services looks like. And I think, the net result of that was that, the sort of the startups, sort of just began to change a bit. They'd reached that scale where they could seriously be taking on these huge firms. And it's hard to put your finger on exactly what it is. It was more a
Yeah.
sort of confluence thing. So
Yeah, you
I guess,
mentioned boxing match. It feels as well a bit as more like maybe WWE tag team, because they also partner with each other sometimes and compete with each
yeah,
other sometimes,
absolutely, yeah.
and invest. I guess where we see the funding for the startups. What we don't see is how much the legacy banks have invested in technology and things like that. But it looks like really whoever wins, there's a technology takeover in finance.
Yes,
From what you seem to say, right? No one is saying, I don't know, we should have more branches and perhaps let go of the apps or something like that. I think from the legacy, well, the startups obviously, but even the legacy players, I think everybody seems to be thinking about that at the moment.
absolutely. And I think technology is critical, and obviously the smartphone sort of overlays that. I think about 82% of Americans own a smartphone. In the UK, it's more like 78%, but still, these are staggering numbers. And yeah, I think that you're completely right that actually behind the scenes, there's all sorts of alliances and investment and things like that. But yeah, I think when you look back at the history of finance in the UK, which I did once in a very interesting presentation, not one I did myself, one that I watched, and there's always been attrition of banks, and normally it occurs during a crisis. So I think the last huge, if we're to discount the financial crisis, so the last time there was a huge sort of almost culling of banks was in 1929 or soon after, when I think dozens and dozens of private banks in the UK, in the city, London, just sort of collapsed pretty much overnight. And I think there's no reason to suspect that this period might not be too different. But I also think the sort of the dynamics of who might sort of ultimately win in the end are very complicated, and perhaps are as much to do with funding or talent, whereas I think before it was a lot more simple, because you would just run out of money, or all your debts would go bad, whereas now it's a bit more of a complicated picture.
Yeah. But it's really fascinating and mind-blowing to consider this and to consider the magnitude of events if you compare to 1929, and perhaps to watch from the sideline and maybe not fighting into it. You've recently had a very interesting series of events during the lockdown where you interviewed a lot of executives, a lot of CEOs, in one-on-one conversation like we do now. I mean, there's been a lot, so I don't know if you can find a common thread or some highlights through the series. What are the top things you've learned from that?
Yeah, very very interesting question, and obviously, we're talking to lots of people generally, sort of day to day as well. And I guess one of the commonest themes is maybe perhaps an obvious one, but I think the anticipation is an acceleration of some of these changes that we've been talking about. You obviously mentioned branches. I think there's going to be a lot of people who realize actually they need to make, if they weren't already, they need to make digital banking part of their sort of core daily usage. And I think that's the expectation, that there is that this will bring forward an acceleration of digitization. We're already quite advanced, I guess, in the UK, here in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's still clearly tens of millions of people who maybe have been a bit nervous about having a digital bank, a digital only bank as their main account. And that's a hurdle, I feel, for the digital banks. But I would say that, I think as long as they can sort of hold on, then I think probably there'll be long-term beneficiaries. and that did seem to be, the case, particularly amongst, we had this summit 3 weeks ago with 10 CEOs, and that seemed to be the case. But yeah, I think sort of funding is very, very key, and in this scenario, your cash burn is just so critical. Even if you've got a great product and a great brand, your cash burn is everything. But we are seeing deals happen, and we're seeing fundraisers happen. So it does seem to be that investors are still willing to pay up, but obviously we don't know what those terms are.
Sure. And then what do you make of the news of, you mentioned Monzo, Revolut, not to pick on anyone, but some reduction, restructuring in some firms? Is it to adjust to that? Perhaps like we need to burn less cash flow, we need to last longer, or is it, we were picturing things too big? Is it just a minor thing maybe?
I mean, it's, I think it's always very, very sad to hear about redundancies at any company. And that's I guess been the big news today. So I think the news was broke last night actually by TechCrunch, that Monzo was making about 120 staff redundant. There wasn't much detail as to who those people were, but without sort of being too specific, there was quite a lot of, signals on Twitter today, of Monzo staff who I guess were concerned about their jobs, and yeah, I think there has been some reports as well that there might be similar things at Revolut. I think Wired covered that also today. We haven't confirmed that at Altfi, so I don't know
Sure.
how correct that is. But I guess it felt a little bit inevitable that there would be redundancies at some point in fintech, just because the hiring was just on such an incredible scale last year. But that being said, I think it's a very delicate game because fundamentally banks, particularly, other fintechs may be a bit different, but banks particularly, with being very, very consumer facing, do sort of trade on their sort of trust and that sort of thing. So, I'm not saying people would trust a bank less if they're making redundancies, but who knows how that could be interpreted. So, I think it's a very tough time. But I do think also that there's every reason to believe that the fintech scene is actually quite robust and healthy, taken as a whole. So hopefully those people can find jobs elsewhere. Like I say, I think it's very fair to say that in particularly in certain pockets, the fintech industry is it's a long-term secular growth story. So sort of recession or no recession, or coronavirus or no coronavirus, I think that there'll be enormous amounts of demands for skills, and by extension people.
Sure. And do you see any particular sector of fintech or areas or maybe firm where there are brighter spots?
Well, I think lending is obviously an area that is, hit hard in any sort of crisis, potentially, and particularly the sort of alternative lenders that we cover, because, obviously defaults can go up, but also because they're, most, not all, but are, they're using funding lines from external people or institutions. And obviously that's threatened, by market sentiment. Not always, and not necessarily in this case, but potentially. Now, coming out of the recession, and this was a point actually made by Giles Andrews at Zopa on a webinar we did last week. But lending is a very, very, very powerful place to be in any sort of recovery, because obviously the demand for finance goes up hugely. And as I understand from Giles's wisdom, loans written in sort of the recovery phase of an economic cycle are actually very good loans. So I think lending, as a very early area of fintech, is very much due some new interesting players, and I think that in the inevitable recovery period, I don't know when that will be. I don't know if it will be this year, next, or longer. But I think there'll be some brilliant opportunities. I would say also that I'm very bullish on the open banking or open finance sort of world, if you want to call it. The sort of the APIs in finance is maybe another way to put it. So the Plaids of this world. I think there's huge amounts of long-term sort of benefits that can bring to governments, to individuals, to businesses. And I think it will be very much subject to a sort of, I guess, I don't know how familiar you are with Moore's law, but, the sort of exponential improvement and lowering in costs in capacity. So I think that, we'll see quite a bit of that. And who knows, maybe even a sort of Netflix of banking could one day come along and, allow you great amounts of choice and competitive marketplaces to find the best deals for borrowing or savings or sort of various wealth management products. So I think that there's enormous amount that can happen in that, but I think it will be it'll be a slow and steady effect.
Wow, not so many perspectives. It's really you can look at it from all the directions. First, I really like your image of the 4 players, or maybe the 4 boxers, or maybe the 4 armies meeting in the middle, and then all those possibilities. I guess we could discuss it at length for a long time, but to conclude, let me go back to Altfi, and maybe let's start by talking about your events with the CEOs recently. It's an interesting experiment in terms of communicating, during the lockdown, but could also be implemented, anytime. So how did that work out, and what were the lessons from it? Are there things that you think might be used again in the future in terms of communication?
So we have had physical events since 2013. We have a big event in London, but also big event in Australia, and we also have held events in continental Europe, in Amsterdam, in Berlin, in Toronto. So that's always been a really core part of our calendar, and obviously, the disruption of coronavirus has stopped that. But I'm actually very impressed with the digital format for events. I think, clearly I'm an advocate for digital things, but I'm also a big advocate for the analog world. I get a paper delivered every weekend, and I much prefer to read that than I do, read an iPhone. But I do think that the digital events world has been hugely sort of ignored, and it's sort of hard to figure out why, really. But now I think it's going to be something that stays, even when inevitable return to physical events happens. And I think one of the reasons I like it so much is because it's just so fantastically global. So we had somebody who had tuned in just because they wanted to ask Anne Boden a question. So Anne Boden, CEO of Starling Bank. So that would never have been possible, before. I mean, I guess Anne Boden could have flown to Australia, or this person could have flown to London for one of our events. But when you think about how easily that was done, and how efficiently, and obviously, without costly, and polluting airline sort of expenditure. And at the same time as having someone in Australia, I think we had somebody we had several people tuning in from North America. So I think that's just such an inspiring sort of revelation, really, that it seems so obvious to say, but it was fantastic. And like you said,
No, I was going to give you my feedback from the other side of the screen, and I thought it was really great. I thought somehow that, when you're in a big event and there's people on the stage, maybe it's the same content, maybe it's the same questions, but I felt that also there's somehow less distance between. There was somehow a more intimate conversation. So yeah, it's something definitely very, very interesting, and hopefully. For your industry, a good, alternative or additional offering, right, in terms of the event.
Yeah, I think so. But I would say that I think it's always better to think about sort of complementary relationships between analog and digital. So, obviously some things are digitized and will never go back to being analog. But I think